The door was not supposed to be open. Lyra Ashford stood frozen in the hallway of the pack house, the basket of herbs still hanging from her arm, staring at the two figures tangled together on the bed she shared with her mate. For one terrible second, her mind refused to accept what her eyes were showing her. Then the smell hit her, sharp and unmistakable, and the basket slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed louder than any scream. Damien Voss turned first. His face went white, then red, then a color Lyra had never seen on him before, something between shame and panic. He said her name, but it came out broken, useless, a word with no weight behind it. The woman beside him pulled the sheet up slowly, almost lazily, as if she had all the time in the world. Celine. Of course it was Celine. The same Celine who used to sit beside Lyra's sister at every pack gathering, who used to braid her sister's hair before festivals, who had cried at her sister's funeral louder than anyone else in the room. And here was her closest friend, in her sister's place, in her bed, with her mate. "Lyra, wait," Damien said, throwing the blanket aside and reaching for his trousers. "This is not what it looks like." She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, something inside her went very quiet, very still, like a lake freezing over in a single night. She looked at him, really looked, searching his face for some kind of explanation that would make this bearable. She found nothing. Just guilt, dressed up as regret.
"Don't," she said. Her voice did not shake.
She was proud of that. Later, when she thought back on this moment, her voice did not shake at all. "Don't say anything." Celine had the decency to look away, at least. But there was something in the corner of her mouth, something small and satisfied, that told Lyra this had not been a mistake. This had been a decision, maybe more than one. Lyra turned and walked out of the room. Behind her, she heard Damien call her name again, heard the sound of him stumbling to follow, but she did not run. Running would mean she was afraid, and she was not going to give either of them the satisfaction of her fear. She walked down the long hallway with its portraits of Voss ancestors staring down at her, past the study where Damien signed treaties with rival packs, past the nursery that had been prepared for a child no one else yet knew existed, and out into the cool evening air. She had found out about the baby only 3 days earlier. She had been planning to tell him that night, over dinner, with candles and a small cake she had asked the kitchen to bake in secret. She had imagined his face lighting up. She had imagined him lifting her off her feet the way he used to when they were newly mated, laughing, spinning her in circles until she begged him to stop. Instead, she stood on the back steps of the pack house, with her hand pressed flat against her stomach, and she made a decision that would change everything. She would not tell him. Not tonight. Not ever, if she could help it. The Voss pack was not just a family. It was a kingdom disguised as a family, with rules older than the mountains that surrounded their territory. An heir was not simply a child. An heir was a claim, a weapon, a piece on a board that powerful people had been playing for centuries. If Damien knew she was carrying his child, he would never let her go. Not because he loved her, not anymore, not really. He would keep her because the pack needed an heir, because appearances needed to be maintained, because a king without a mate and a child was a king people whispered about in dark corners. She would not spend the rest of her life as a broodmare with a crown on her head, sleeping down the hall from a man who chose someone else the moment her back was turned. Corwin, the head of the pack guards, found her sitting on the garden wall an hour later, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at nothing. He was a broad, quiet man who had known Lyra since she was a girl, back when her sister was still alive, and the three of them used to run through these same gardens as children, before rank and duty had separated them into their different roles. "You heard," Lyra said. It wasn't a question. "The whole East Wing heard the crash of your basket," Corwin said gently, sitting down beside her, careful to leave space between them. "But I did not need to hear anything, to know something was wrong. You have not smiled since I found you here." Lyra let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't think I will be smiling again for a long time." Corwin did not press her. That was one of the things she had always appreciated about him. He simply sat with her in the settling darkness, while the stars came out one by one, above the pack house. And when she finally spoke again, her words surprised even her.
"I need you to help me leave."
Corwin turned to look at her fully then, his expression unreadable in the low light. "Leave?" Lyra, you are the Alpha King's mate. You cannot simply walk out of the gates. The wards would not let you far, and even if they did, every wolf in this territory would be hunting for your scent within the hour. Then I need a way around the wards, she said, and I need it before he decides to explain himself to me again, because next time, I do not know if I will be strong enough to say no. She did not tell him about the baby. Not yet. She trusted Corwin, but some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with the people who loved you, especially in a place where walls seemed to have ears, and loyalty could shift like sand in a strong wind. Corwin studied her for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Finally he spoke, his voice low. There is an old trail. Your sister found it, years ago, back before she was strong enough to run with the pack on formal hunts. It goes along the river, past the old mill, and out beyond the northern boundary where the wards are weakest, because no one expected anyone to be foolish enough to try crossing there. It is dangerous, rocky. If you slip, there is no one to catch you. I will not slip, Lyra said, though she had no way of knowing that would be true. You will need supplies, time. A reason no one questions your absence for at least a full day, maybe two, before anyone starts asking hard questions. Corwin rubbed a hand over his jaw, thinking quickly now, the guard in him taking over from the friend. I can arrange a distraction. A supply run to the southern village, something that would keep the guard's attention pointed the wrong direction. But Lyra, once you go, there may be no coming back. Not easily, not for a long while. I understand, she said, and she did, more than he could have known in that moment. That night, Lyra did not sleep. She lay in a guest room down the hall from the room she used to share with Damien, listening to the sounds of the pack house settling around her, the distant howl of a young wolf out on patrol, the creak of old wooden beams cooling after the heat of the day. She thought about her sister, about the years they had shared before illness took her far too young, about the promise she had made at her sister's grave, to always protect what family she had left. She had not known, back then, that the family she needed to protect would one day be a child no one else knew was coming. By the time the sun rose, she had packed a small bag with the essentials, hidden beneath a floorboard in the guest room that Corwin had shown her years ago, back when the two of them used to hide sweets from the kitchen as children. She dressed in plain traveling clothes instead of the fine fabrics expected of an Alpha King's mate. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, at the woman staring back at her, and did not recognize the hardness that had settled into her eyes overnight. Damien tried to speak with her twice that day. Both times, she found reasons to be elsewhere, claiming errands in the village, time needed with the pack healer, anything that kept distance between them. She could feel his frustration building, could sense through the thin thread of their mate bond that he was growing desperate to explain himself, to make things right, but she kept the wall around her heart as high and as thick as she could manage. Celine, at least, had the sense to stay out of sight. That evening, as the pack gathered for the communal meal, Lyra excused herself early, claiming a headache. No one questioned it. Why would they? She had given them no reason to suspect that anything unusual was happening, that this ordinary excuse was the last lie she would tell them for a very long time. She slipped out through the kitchen gardens as the moon began to rise, following the path Corwin had described to her, past the old mill where the wheel had stopped turning decades ago, its wood rotted and soft with age. The river ran loud beside her, swollen from recent rains, and she pressed close to the rocks to avoid the spray as she made her way north, toward the weak point in the wards that would let her slip beyond the only home she had ever known. Her heart pounded with every step, not from fear of the darkness or the uneven ground beneath her feet, but from the enormity of what she was doing. She was leaving behind everything familiar, her position, her title, her mate, the pack that had raised her from a pup. She was walking into a future with no clear shape, carrying a secret that would define the rest of her life. When she reached the boundary marker, an old standing stone half swallowed by moss and ivy, she paused and looked back the way she had come. In the distance, the lights of the pack house glowed warm against the night sky, and for just a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm her resolve. This had been her home. Whatever else it had become, it had also been her home. She reached up and unclasped the pendant around her neck, the one Damien had given her the night he claimed her as his mate, a small silver wolf with eyes made of tiny sapphires. She had loved that pendant once. Now it felt like a chain. She did not throw it away. Some part of her could not bring herself to do that. Instead, she made her way back, just far enough to reach the edge of the garden, and set it gently on the stone bench where she used to sit with her sister, where anyone searching would eventually find it, and understand, without a single word being spoken, that she had chosen to go, and did not intend to be followed. Then she turned north again, crossed the boundary marker, and did not look back a second time. The forest beyond the wards was different from the forest she knew. Wilder. Untamed by generations of pack patrols and careful management, she moved carefully, using skills her sister had taught her years ago during their childhood explorations, staying close to water, avoiding open ground where her scent might carry too far on the wind. By the time dawn broke, she had put a full day's distance between herself and the only life she had ever known. She found a hollow beneath an old fallen tree, sheltered from view, and allowed herself, finally, to rest. Her body ached, her heart ached more. But beneath the exhaustion and the grief, there was something else too, something small and steady and new. She pressed her hand against her stomach again, the way she had on the garden steps the night before, and for the first time since walking in on Damien and Celine, she allowed herself to cry. Not from anger this time, and not entirely from sorrow. She cried because she understood, in that quiet hollow beneath the fallen tree, that she was no longer just Lyra Ashford, betrayed mate of the Alpha King. She was about to become someone's mother. And she intended to make certain that whoever this child became, they would never know the taste of betrayal that had driven their mother into the wilderness on a moonlit night, carrying nothing but a small bag of supplies and a secret larger than any kingdom. Somewhere behind her, in the pack house she had left in darkness, a silver pendant lay waiting on a garden bench, cold and silent, holding all the answers that no one yet knew to ask. The sun rose fully now, spilling gold light through the canopy above her hiding place, and Lyra closed her eyes, allowing herself, at last, a few hours of uneasy sleep before she needed to move again. Tomorrow, she would find a way to put even greater distance between herself and the world of packs and kings and betrayal. Tomorrow, she would begin the long, uncertain work of building a life in secret. But for now, in this fragile moment of stillness, she simply breathed and let the forest hold her, and did not think about what would happen when the pack finally discovered that both she and their future heir were gone. Damien Voss woke to an empty bed and a silence that felt wrong before he even opened his eyes. He reached across the sheets out of habit, expecting to find Lyra curled on her side the way she always slept, and found only cold fabric where her warmth should have been. For a moment he told himself she had risen early, that she was down in the kitchens or out walking the gardens the way she sometimes did when her mind was troubled. Then he remembered the look on her face 2 nights before, the stillness in her voice that had frightened him more than any shout ever could have, and dread settled into his stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. He was on his feet and dressed within minutes, moving through the pack house with long, urgent strides, checking every room she might have retreated to, the healer's quarters, the library, the small sitting room where she liked to read when she wanted to be alone. Each empty room made the dread grow heavier. It was Corwin who found him first, standing at the end of the hallway, with an expression carefully arranged into neutral concern, though Damien, who had known the man for over a decade, could see the tightness around his eyes that suggested he was hiding something. "Have you seen Lyra this morning?" Damien asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. "No, my king," Corwin said, and the words were true, technically, since he had not seen her that particular morning. He had seen her the night before, disappearing into the trees along the northern trail, but there was no reason to volunteer information that had not been directly requested. Damien searched the entire pack house by midday, then extended the search to the surrounding grounds, then finally, with mounting panic clawing at his chest, ordered the full pack to begin combing the territory. Word spread quickly among the wolves. The Alpha King's mate had vanished. No one knew when, no one knew how, and worse, no one could pick up a fresh trail. It was Damien himself who found the pendant. He had wandered into the garden almost without thinking, drawn there by memories of quieter days, of Lyra sitting on the stone bench with sunlight in her hair, laughing at something he had said. He nearly missed it at first, a small glint of silver catching the afternoon light. When he realized what he was looking at, his knees nearly gave out beneath him. He picked up the pendant with hands that were not entirely steady. The small silver wolf with sapphire eyes, the one he had commissioned from the finest craftsman in the region, the one he had placed around her neck on the night he claimed her, whispering promises he had meant with his whole heart at the time. She had left it behind, deliberately. There was no other explanation. She had not lost it, had not misplaced it in some accident. She had removed it, and left it where she knew, eventually, someone would find it. It was not just jewelry. It was a message. She had not just left the pack house. She had rejected everything the pendant represented. Their bond, their mating. Him. Damien sat down heavily on the stone bench, the pendant clutched in his fist, and for the first time since becoming Alpha King, he felt something dangerously close to despair. Celine found him there an hour later. She approached carefully, the way one might approach a wounded animal, her expression carefully arranged into sympathy that did not quite reach her eyes. "Damien," she said softly, using his name without title, a familiarity she had never been granted before that night, 3 days ago. "I am so sorry. This is my fault. I should never have let things go so far. If I could take it back, I would." He looked at her, and something in his expression must have frightened her, because she took a small step backward. "Do not speak to me right now," he said, his voice low and rough. "Do not speak to me at all." She left without another word, though Damien noticed, in the periphery of his grief, that she did not seem particularly troubled by his rejection. If anything, there was a strange patience in the set of her shoulders as she walked away, as though she were confident that whatever damage had been done would eventually resolve in her favor, given enough time. By evening, the trackers had returned with grim faces and empty hands. Lyra's scent had led them along the northern trail, past the old mill, all the way to the boundary marker, where it simply stopped, as if she had vanished into thin air at the edge of the wards. She knew the weak point, one of the senior trackers reported. A grizzled wolf, named Victor, who had served the pack for over 30 years, and had trained most of the younger guards himself. Someone told her where to cross, or she found it through pure luck, though I doubt luck alone could explain such a clean escape. Beyond the marker, the rain from 2 nights ago has washed away any trail worth following. We searched the surrounding forest for miles in every direction. Nothing. Damien sat at the head of the long council table that night, staring at a map of the territory spread before him, tracing the boundary line with his finger over and over, as if repetition alone might reveal some secret path his mate had taken. The pack elders sat around him in uneasy silence, unwilling to speak the thoughts clearly weighing on all their minds. An Alpha King who could not keep his own mate within the pack territory was an Alpha King whose authority could be questioned. Rival packs would hear of this within days, if they had not already. Some might see opportunity in the instability. Territory disputes that had lain dormant for years might reawaken. The delicate balance of power across the region depended, in part, on the perception of strength at the top of every pack, and right now, strength was the last thing Damien Voss felt. "We continue the search," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury and grief in equal measure. "Every trail, every rumor, every human town within 100 miles. She cannot have gone far without resources, without support. Someone will have seen her." But the weeks that followed proved him wrong. Lyra had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed her. Corwin, throughout this time, said nothing about what he knew. He had promised Lyra a full day's head start at minimum, and he intended to honor that promise, even as guilt gnawed at him every time he looked into Damien's grief-stricken face. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself Lyra had her reasons she had not fully shared even with him, and that those reasons deserved to be respected, rather than betrayed to a king who had, after all, brought this catastrophe upon himself. Celine, meanwhile, began positioning herself carefully within the pack hierarchy, offering comfort to Damien at moments when his guard was lowest, making herself indispensable in small, calculated ways. She organized the search efforts when Damien was too consumed by grief to think clearly. She sat with the pack elders and offered gentle suggestions about maintaining stability during the crisis. She was patient, methodical, and utterly convinced that time would eventually deliver her the position she believed she deserved. What none of them knew, not Damien and his grief, not Corwin and his guilt, not even Celine and her quiet ambition, was that Lyra was not simply hiding somewhere within reach, waiting to be found. She had already crossed into human territory, had already begun the long process of erasing every trace of the wolf she had once been, and carried within her a secret that would, one day, shatter every careful plan being built in her absence. For now, though, the pack house remained locked in uncertainty, its king staring at maps that offered no answers, its council whispering about succession and stability, and its walls holding the echo of a silver pendant that had said, without a single word, everything that needed to be said. The days stretched into weeks. The weeks began to stretch toward a month. Damien stopped sleeping in the room he had shared with Lyra, unable to bear the emptiness of it, and moved instead to a smaller chamber down the hall, one with no memories attached to its walls. He continued to send trackers out in ever-widening circles, continued to offer rewards through trusted contacts in the human settlements for any information about a woman matching Lyra's description, continued to hope, against mounting evidence, that she would simply walk back through the gates one day as though nothing had happened. She did not. And with each passing week, the whispers within the pack grew louder, the rival packs grew bolder in their small territorial tests, and the throne that Damien Voss had once held with unquestioned authority began, slowly and steadily, to show the first hairline cracks that would, in time, threaten to bring the entire structure down around him. 6 weeks after Lyra vanished, the first rival pack made its move. It began small, the way these things always did. A boundary marker on the eastern edge of Voss territory was found knocked down, though no witnesses could say who had done it. A patrol of young wolves reported catching an unfamiliar scent near the river crossing that fed into the southern farmlands. Nothing that could not be explained away by accident or coincidence, except that these small incidents kept happening, one after another, each one testing how quickly and how forcefully the pack would respond. Damien knew exactly what was happening. He had grown up learning the unspoken language of pack politics, had watched his own father navigate similar tests during moments of perceived weakness decades earlier. Other alphas were probing his territory, searching for cracks, waiting to see whether the king who had lost his mate had also lost his grip on power. He called an emergency council meeting on a gray morning that matched his mood perfectly. The long table was filled with the pack's senior members, faces he had known his entire life, though lately, they looked at him with a caution that had not existed before Lyra's disappearance. Victor, the grizzled tracker who had led the initial search, sat near the head of the table, arms crossed, his expression grim. The Harwick pack has moved wolves closer to our eastern border 3 times this month, Victor reported without preamble. Each time they retreat before we can confront them directly, but the pattern is clear. They are testing our response times, our patrol strength, how quickly word travels through our ranks. This is not random. This is calculated. And the southern crossing? Damien asked, though he already suspected the answer. The same, Victor confirmed. Different pack. Likely one of the smaller territories looking to expand while our attention is divided. They know something has shaken this pack to its foundation. My king. They know, and they intend to use it. Around the table, murmurs of concern rippled through the assembled elders. One of the older council members, a sharp-eyed woman named Rosalind who had served 3 generations of Voss alphas, finally spoke the words no one else had dared to voice directly. My king, forgive my bluntness, but the pack needs to see strength from you now, more than ever. Grief is natural. Loss is natural. But an alpha who is seen mourning too openly, for too long, becomes an alpha who is seen as vulnerable. We need you visible. We need you leading patrols yourself, handling disputes personally, reminding every wolf within these borders, and every rival watching from beyond them, that the Voss pack remains exactly as strong as it has always been. Damien absorbed her words in silence, feeling the truth in them even as they stung. He had spent the past 6 weeks consumed by his search for Lyra, delegating pack business to Corwin and the council, while he chased rumors and dead ends across the region. He had let his personal grief compromise his duty, and now that failure was manifesting as very real, very dangerous vulnerability along his borders. You are right, he said finally, straightening in his seat, forcing steel back into his spine that had softened under the weight of loss. I have allowed my search for Lyra to distract from my responsibilities here. That changes today. He assigned himself to lead the next border patrol personally, much to the visible relief of the assembled council. He ordered increased training sessions for the younger wolves, a show of strength meant to discourage further testing from neighboring territories. He began attending every dispute resolution personally, rather than delegating to junior officials, ensuring that every wolf within his territory, and every wolf watching from beyond it, understood clearly that the Voss Alpha remained firmly in control. It was exhausting, presenting strength while his heart remained shattered beneath the surface, but he managed it, day after day, week after week, gradually rebuilding the confidence that had wavered throughout the pack. Celine, throughout this period, made herself increasingly present in Damien's daily life. She attended council meetings, offering quiet, sensible suggestions that made the elders nod approvingly. She organized supply logistics for the increased patrols. She sat beside Damien during formal pack dinners, close enough to suggest intimacy, without crossing any line he might object to, patient, in a way that suggested she was playing a much longer game than anyone around her realized. "You have handled these past weeks with remarkable strength," she told him one evening, as the two of them reviewed patrol schedules together in his study, the candlelight casting long shadows across the maps spread between them. "The pack sees it, even if they do not say so directly. They see a king who did not let personal tragedy break him." "I am not certain strength is the right word," Damien said quietly, not looking up from the map. "I am simply doing what needs to be done." "That is precisely what strength looks like," Celine said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly, a gesture he did not immediately pull away from, though something in his expression tightened. "Lyra made her choice, Damien. Whatever her reasons, she chose to leave, rather than stay, and work through what happened between us. You cannot spend the rest of your life waiting for a door that may never open again." He did pull his hand away then, standing abruptly, and moving toward the window, staring out at the dark grounds below. "I do not wish to discuss this." "Of course," Celine said smoothly, gathering the maps without complaint, though the faint tightening around her eyes suggested irritation carefully masked. "Forgive me for overstepping." She left him alone in his study that night, but she did not stop her careful campaign. Over the following weeks, she continued positioning herself as indispensable, continued offering comfort at precisely calculated moments, continued reminding Damien, subtly and persistently, that the future of the pack required stability, and stability required a mate at his side. What Damien did not know, what none of the pack council knew, was that Celine's ambitions ran far deeper than simple romantic interest. She had watched Lyra hold the position of Alpha King's mate for years, had watched from the sidelines as her closest friend's sister received honors and respect that Celine believed, in her private heart, she deserved far more than Lyra ever had. When Lyra's sister passed away, Celine had grieved sincerely, but grief had slowly curdled into something else over the following seasons. A quiet resentment that Lyra had inherited, not just her sister's position of respect within the pack, but eventually, the very mate bond with the future Alpha King that Celine herself had once hoped to claim. The encounter Damien had walked into, the one that shattered his mating bond and drove Lyra into the wilderness, had not been the accident it appeared to be. Celine had spent months cultivating opportunities, waiting patiently for a moment when Damien's guard would be lowered enough, when circumstances would align in her favor. She had not forced anything. She was too clever for something so obvious. She had simply positioned herself perfectly and waited for Damien's own weaknesses, loneliness during a difficult period when Lyra had been consumed by grief over an anniversary connected to her sister's passing, to do the rest. Corwin suspected something of this nature, watching Celine's careful maneuvering with growing unease throughout those weeks. Though he had no proof, nothing concrete he could bring to Damien without risking accusations of baseless jealousy or misplaced loyalty. He kept his suspicions to himself, watching, waiting, uncertain what to do with information he could not confirm. Meanwhile, far beyond the reach of any Voss tracker, Lyra continued building her new life in careful anonymity, unaware of the political storm brewing in her absence, unaware of Celine's long game finally reaching its intended destination, unaware that the child growing within her would, one day, become the very key that would unlock every secret currently being so carefully hidden. The border tests from rival packs eventually slowed as Damien's renewed visible strength discouraged further probing, though the underlying tension never fully disappeared. The Voss pack settled into an uneasy new normal. A king ruling with a hollow space where his mate should have been. A council increasingly comfortable with Celine's growing presence. and a secret, buried deep in the wilderness beyond their borders, waiting patiently for the day it would finally come to light. The town of Millbrook sat quietly among rolling hills, far enough from any pack territory that Lyra had chosen it deliberately after weeks of careful, exhausting travel. It was a small human settlement, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors but few asked too many questions about newcomers, provided those newcomers kept to themselves and caused no trouble. Lyra arrived there with almost nothing, a small bag of supplies long since emptied, coins earned through odd jobs along her journey, and a new name she had chosen for herself somewhere along the way. Grace Miller, she told the innkeeper who rented her a small room above the tavern, a widow traveling to stay with distant relatives, though those relatives never seemed to materialize, and eventually people simply stopped asking. She found work quickly enough. Her knowledge of herbs and healing, learned from years spent assisting the pack healer back home, translated easily into a role tending to Millbrook's minor illnesses and injuries, since the town's only proper doctor lived 2 villages over, and rarely made the journey unless absolutely necessary. Within a month, Grace Miller had become a quietly essential figure in the community, known for her steady hands and her calm, reassuring presence during moments of crisis. She rented a small cottage at the edge of town, modest but sturdy. With a garden plot she began cultivating with the same herbs and plants she had once tended within pack walls. The work kept her hands busy, and her mind occupied, which was a mercy, because the moments when her hands were idle were the moments when grief and fear crept in uninvited. Her pregnancy advanced steadily through those early months in Millbrook, and she learned quickly how to hide the changes in her body beneath loose clothing, how to explain away her occasional bouts of morning sickness as a lingering illness from her travels, how to navigate a human community without revealing the parts of herself that made her fundamentally different from everyone around her. The most difficult part was hiding her wolf nature entirely. She had spent her whole life surrounded by others like herself, never needing to suppress the instincts and abilities that came as naturally as breathing. Now, every full moon brought a private agony, retreating deep into the forest beyond her cottage, forcing her shift alone in darkness, biting back the howls that wanted to tear free from her throat, terrified that any human witness would end the fragile safety she had built for herself and her unborn child. It was during one of these difficult nights, several months into her time in Millbrook, that she met Mara Whitlock. Lyra had not expected anyone else to be wandering the forest paths so late, had assumed her careful timing and remote location would keep her secret safe. But she rounded a bend in the trail after shifting back to her human form, exhausted and shaking from the effort, and found herself face to face with a woman about her own age, carrying a lantern and a basket of foraged mushrooms. For a long, terrifying moment, neither woman spoke. Lyra braced herself for screams, for questions she had no good answers to, for the unraveling of everything she had worked so hard to build. Instead, Mara simply studied her for a moment, taking in Lyra's disheveled state, the exhaustion clearly written across her features, and said only, "You look like you could use some tea and a place to sit down." It was not the reaction Lyra had expected, and something about its simplicity nearly broke the careful composure she had maintained for months. She followed Mara back to a small cottage not far from her own, accepted the offered tea with trembling hands, and found herself, for the first time since fleeing the pack house, in the presence of someone who did not demand explanations she could not give. Mara never asked directly what she had witnessed that night in the forest. She was a practical woman, a widow herself who had buried a husband some years earlier, and learned, through hard experience, that everyone carried secrets worth respecting, rather than prying into. Over the following weeks, the two women developed a quiet friendship built on shared silences as much as shared conversation, and Lyra found herself, cautiously, allowing this stranger closer than she had allowed anyone since leaving her old life behind. "You are further along than you let on, aren't you?" Mara said one afternoon, several months later, as the two of them sat in Lyra's garden shelling peas for the evening meal. It was not quite a question. Lyra's hands stilled over the basket between them. She could have denied it, could have deflected the way she had deflected every other probing comment over the past months, but something in Mara's steady, kind gaze made the denial feel unnecessary, even unwelcome. 6 months, she admitted quietly. Perhaps closer to 7 now. "And the father?" Mara asked gently, though there was no judgment in the question, only genuine concern. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the peas in her lap, memories of Damien's face the night she had discovered his betrayal, rising unbidden in her mind. "Not part of this child's life," she said finally. "That is all I can say." Mara accepted this without pressing further, though her expression softened with sympathy. "Well then, you will need help when the time comes. I have delivered enough babies in this town to know what I am doing, and I will not have you facing this alone, whatever brought you to Millbrook in the first place." Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, and found herself, for the first time in months, allowing herself to lean on someone else's strength, rather than carrying every burden entirely alone. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I do not know what I would have done without your kindness these past months." The following weeks passed in a haze of preparation, Mara teaching her practical skills for the birth ahead, the two women growing closer, with each shared task, each quiet evening spent together over simple meals and gentle conversation. Lyra found herself, gradually, beginning to breathe more easily, beginning to imagine a future that stretched beyond mere survival into something resembling genuine peace. But peace, she knew, was fragile, and the closer her due date approached, the more she found herself thinking about what would happen once her child was born. A child with unmistakable wolf blood running through their veins, a child who would eventually need to understand their heritage, their nature, even as Lyra worked to keep them hidden from the world that had driven her into hiding in the first place. She thought often, during those quiet months, about her sister, about the promises she had made at her graveside years earlier. She thought about the family she had lost, first to illness and then to betrayal, and about the new family taking shape within her own body, a child who would carry forward everything good she remembered about her old life while, she hoped desperately, avoiding every poison that had corrupted it. She thought too, though less often and with considerably more complicated emotion, about Damien, about whether he had continued searching for her, about whether Celine had claimed the position at his side that she had clearly always wanted, about whether the pack she had once called home remained standing, or had crumbled beneath the weight of her absence and the political tests that surely would have followed such an obvious display of weakness at its center. She told herself these thoughts did not matter anymore, that she had made her choice and needed to focus entirely on the life ahead of her rather than the one she had left behind. Most days, she almost believed it. As the final weeks of her pregnancy approached, Millbrook settled into an early autumn chill, golden leaves drifting down over the small cottage Lyra now called home. Mara visited daily, helping prepare the small nursery corner Lyra had arranged within her modest bedroom, sharing stories of her own children now grown and moved away to distant towns, offering the kind of warm, practical companionship that Lyra had not realized how desperately she needed until she finally received it. On a cold evening in late autumn, as wind rattled the shutters of her small cottage and rain began to fall in earnest against the windows, Lyra felt the first true pains of labor begin, and understood, with a mixture of terror and fierce determination, that the moment she had spent months preparing for had finally arrived. The storm outside grew fiercer as the night wore on, rain hammering against the small cottage, while Lyra labored through hours of pain that seemed to stretch endlessly, each contraction pulling her further from coherent thought and deeper into pure, animal instinct. Mara stayed beside her through every moment, her calm competence a steady anchor amid the chaos, wiping Lyra's forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement, guiding her through breathing techniques that helped, if only marginally, to manage the overwhelming intensity building within her. "You are doing beautifully," Mara said during a brief lull between contractions, her voice steady, despite the late hour, and the visible strain of the long night. "Not much longer now, I think. The baby is close." Lyra managed only a weak nod, gathering what strength remained for the trials still ahead. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and beneath the pain, she felt something else stirring, something ancient and instinctive, tied to her wolf nature. A fierce protective urge that had nothing to do with human customs of childbirth, and everything to do with the deep biological drive to bring her child safely into the world. She fought the urge to shift, knowing the physical transformation during labor could prove dangerous for both herself and the child, forcing herself to remain in human form through sheer will alone. gritting her teeth against pain that seemed to demand release in forms her human body could not easily provide. Near dawn, as the storm outside began finally to weaken into gentle rainfall, Lyra's son entered the world with a strong, healthy cry that filled the small cottage and brought fresh tears to both women present for his arrival. Mara cleaned the newborn with practiced, gentle hands, wrapping him in soft blankets Lyra had prepared weeks earlier, before finally placing him carefully into his mother's exhausted, waiting arms. Lyra stared down at her son's face for the first time, and something inside her chest, something that had remained tightly guarded and wounded since the night she discovered Damien's betrayal, finally began, slowly, to heal. He had her eyes, she noticed immediately, the same pale gray that had run through generations of her own family, but his features carried unmistakable echoes of his father as well, a strong jawline even in infancy, dark hair already thick upon his small head. And there, on his left shoulder blade, faint but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, a birthmark shaped precisely like a crescent moon, the ancient sigil that had marked the Voss bloodline for countless generations, passed down from alpha to alpha since the founding of their pack centuries earlier. Lyra had known, somewhere in the back of her mind throughout her pregnancy, that this moment would come, that her child would carry visible proof of his heritage, regardless of how carefully she tried to hide their connection to the pack world. Seeing the mark now, stark against her son's small shoulder, she felt a fresh wave of fierce protectiveness rise within her, a determination that whatever else happened, whatever complications this mark might eventually bring, she would keep her son safe from the poison that had driven her from her old life. "He is beautiful," Mara said softly, watching mother and child with warm affection, tactfully saying nothing about the birthmark she had also clearly noticed, though questions surely lingered behind her kind eyes. "His name is Kale," Lyra said, the decision arriving fully formed, as she gazed down at her son's peaceful, sleeping face. It was a name she had considered many times during her pregnancy, one with no direct connection to either her old pack or the Voss bloodline, a name that belonged entirely to this new chapter of her life, rather than the one she had left behind. The weeks following Kale's birth passed in the particular blur familiar to new mothers everywhere, sleepless nights blending into exhausted days. The small cottage filled with the sounds and demands of a newborn, learning to navigate the world outside his mother's body. Mara visited often during this period, bringing meals, offering practical assistance, allowing Lyra brief windows of rest that she desperately needed to recover her strength. As the weeks turned into months, Lyra began noticing subtle signs that confirmed what she had already suspected. Kale's growth progressed faster than typical for human infants, his senses sharper, his awareness of his surroundings more acute than seemed natural for a child so young. By the time he reached his first year, he had already begun walking with a steadiness that surprised even the town's few observers, his growth continuing at a pace that Lyra recognized, with quiet unease, as distinctly wolf-blooded rather than fully human. She worked carefully to manage these differences, keeping Kale largely within the boundaries of their own property during his early years, limiting his interactions with other children in town, who might notice and remark upon behaviors and abilities that set him apart. It was a delicate balance, wanting her son to experience genuine childhood joy and connection, while simultaneously protecting the secret that could, if discovered by the wrong ears, eventually lead pack trackers directly to their hidden doorstep. Mara became an invaluable ally throughout this period, her quiet acceptance of whatever unusual truths lay behind Lyra's careful reticence, allowing Kale a trusted adult presence beyond his mother, someone who treated him with warmth and affection, without the burden of unanswered questions weighing on their relationship. "He asked me today why he can climb trees faster than the older boys in town," Mara mentioned one afternoon, when Kale was nearing his 4th year, the two women sitting in Lyra's garden while Kale played nearby, chasing butterflies with the boundless energy of early childhood. "I told him some people are simply born strong and quick, and left it there." I hope that was the right thing to say. Lyra watched her son for a long moment, his laughter carrying across the garden as he leaped after a butterfly with a grace that no ordinary human child could match, and felt the familiar weight of the secret she carried pressing down upon her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know these questions will become more difficult to answer as he grows older. I have not yet decided how much truth I can safely share with him, or when." "You will know when the time is right," Mara said with the quiet confidence of someone who had raised children of her own. Children are more perceptive than we often give them credit for, but they also trust their parents implicitly, especially at this age. Whatever you decide to tell him, and whenever you decide to tell it, he will understand that you did so out of love and protection, not deception. Lyra hoped desperately that this would prove true, though the weight of the choices ahead of her felt increasingly heavy as Cale grew, and his questions grew more pointed, more difficult to deflect, with simple explanations about being born strong and quick. She told him small truths as he grew, careful, measured pieces of information, delivered gradually, rather than in one overwhelming revelation. She told him that his father was not part of their lives, that this had been her choice rather than his abandonment, careful to avoid painting Damien as a villain, even as her own heart still ached from the betrayal that had driven her into hiding. She told him, eventually, as he approached his 6th year and his physical abilities became increasingly difficult to hide entirely from curious neighbors, that their family carried unusual blood connected to old legends of wolves that walked as people, though she stopped short of fully explaining the reality of what this meant, uncertain how much a young child could safely understand or successfully keep hidden from prying eyes. Cale accepted these partial truths with the easy trust of childhood, asking occasional follow-up questions, but never pressing beyond what his mother seemed comfortable sharing. He grew into a curious, kind-hearted boy, quick to laugh, fiercely loyal to the small circle of people he loved, his wolf nature manifesting not in aggression or wildness, but in a deep, instinctive protectiveness toward his mother, and toward Mara, whom he had come to think of as something like a grandmother figure, in the absence of any other extended family. Lyra watched her son grow with a complicated mixture of profound love and persistent anxiety, always aware that the peaceful life they had built in Millbrook remained fundamentally fragile, dependent entirely on continued secrecy, continued distance from the pack world that had once been her entire existence. She allowed herself, on her better days, to imagine a future where this fragile peace might eventually solidify into something more permanent, where Cale might grow to adulthood, never needing to know the full weight of the heritage marked upon his shoulder. She did not yet know, as she watched her son chase butterflies through their quiet garden on that peaceful autumn afternoon, how quickly and how completely that fragile peace would soon be shattered. Back within Voss territory, the years since Lyra's disappearance had not been kind to the pack's internal stability, even as Damien's outward displays of strength had, for a time, discouraged the more obvious territorial tests from rival packs. The trouble came instead from within. Celine had, over the intervening years, cemented her position as an indispensable presence at Damien's side, though she had never quite managed to secure the formal mate bond she so clearly desired. Damien, despite the passage of time, remained unable to fully release the connection he had once shared with Lyra, a stubborn thread of loyalty and lingering hope that kept him from formalizing any new relationship, no matter how much political pressure the council applied regarding the pack's need for a clear line of succession. This unresolved tension created exactly the kind of instability that ambitious wolves within the pack hierarchy learned to exploit. Whispers began circulating, quiet at first, then increasingly bold, questioning whether an alpha king, who could not settle his own personal affairs, was truly fit to guide the pack through the challenges facing their territory. Some of the younger, more aggressive wolves began forming quiet alliances among themselves, testing whether alternative leadership might better serve their ambitions. Victor, now considerably older, but still sharp-eyed and perceptive as ever, brought these concerns to Damien directly, during a private council session some years after Lyra's disappearance. Cale, by this time approaching his 6th birthday, in the distant human town, neither Damien nor anyone within the pack yet knew existed. "My king, forgive my directness, but the pack requires resolution," Victor said, his weathered face grave with concern. "Whether that resolution comes through Lyra's eventual return, which grows less likely with each passing year, or through you finally accepting a new mate and securing a clear heir, the current uncertainty cannot continue indefinitely. Rumors of division within our ranks reach my ears with increasing frequency. Wolves grow restless without clear assurance of stable leadership extending into future generations." Damien absorbed this counsel with the weary resignation of a man who had heard variations of this same speech countless times over recent years. "I understand your concerns, Victor. I have understood them for some time now. but I cannot simply manufacture a mate bond through political convenience. Such bonds, when forced or rushed, rarely produce the stability the pack actually requires. With respect, my king, the pack's stability requires action, not philosophy, Victor pressed, an unusual boldness in his tone that reflected genuine desperation regarding the pack's future. Celine has served faithfully at your side for years now. The council has grown comfortable with her presence. Her competence in matters of pack administration is beyond question. Perhaps it is time to consider formalizing what has, in practice, already existed between the two of you for quite some time. Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering Victor's words with an internal conflict he rarely allowed others to witness. Part of him recognized the practical wisdom in the suggestion. Celine had indeed proven herself capable, had managed pack affairs with genuine skill during periods when his own attention had been consumed by grief and searching. Another part of him, though, the part that still remembered Lyra's face on the morning he discovered the pendant she had left behind, resisted the idea, with an intensity that surprised him, even after so many years. I will consider it, he said finally, though both men in the room understood this was more deflection than genuine commitment. Celine, when informed of this conversation by sympathetic council members eager to see the matter finally resolved, redoubled her efforts to make herself absolutely essential to Damien's daily functioning, both professionally and personally. She began appearing at his side during formal pack events with increasing frequency, allowing observers to draw their own conclusions about the nature of their relationship, even without explicit confirmation from Damien himself. What none of the council members, and certainly not Damien, fully understood was the depth of Celine's long-cultivated ambition, nor the lengths she had already gone to secure her position, nor the plans she continued quietly developing for a future she intended to control entirely. Celine had, in the years since Lyra's disappearance, begun a careful, discreet relationship with another pack member, a sharp, ambitious wolf named Gareth, who held moderate rank within the pack's guard structure, but harbored considerably grander ambitions than his current position afforded him. Their relationship remained hidden from pack awareness, conducted with the same careful discretion Celine had once used to arrange her fateful encounter with Damien years earlier. Celine had, in fact, borne Gareth a son roughly 2 years after Lyra's disappearance, a child she had kept largely hidden from pack knowledge, raised quietly under circumstances she carefully controlled, his true parentage obscured behind vague explanations about a brief, unremarkable relationship that had not survived past his infancy. The boy, named Daniel, was being raised with careful attention to certain behaviors and training that Celine insisted upon, preparation for a role she intended him to eventually claim, though few within the pack understood the full scope of her long-term intentions. Celine's true plan extended far beyond simply securing her own position as Damien's mate. She intended, eventually, once her position was sufficiently entrenched, to maneuver circumstances such that her son Daniel might be recognized as Damien's heir, regardless of any biological reality contradicting such a claim. It was an audacious, dangerous scheme, one that required years of careful positioning and patient manipulation to have any hope of success. But Celine had never lacked patience when pursuing something she believed she deserved. Gareth, for his part, remained a willing accomplice in this scheme, his own ambitions for status and influence within the pack aligning neatly with Celine's grander designs. The two of them met rarely, and always with extreme caution, aware that discovery of their ongoing relationship, and particularly of Daniel's true parentage, would unravel every careful plan Celine had spent years constructing. The pack, meanwhile, continued its slow drift toward internal instability, wolves increasingly divided between those who supported Celine's growing influence and those who remained loyal to Damien's original bond with Lyra, however distant and uncertain that connection had become with the passage of time. Corwin found himself increasingly isolated within these shifting political currents, his knowledge of Lyra's escape route weighing on him more heavily with each passing year, wondering whether his continued silence served any purpose beyond protecting a secret that might, ultimately, do more harm than good by remaining buried. He said nothing, still, bound by a promise made years earlier to a woman he had genuinely believed deserved the chance to build a life free from the pack politics that had brought her such profound pain. But he watched Celine's growing influence with increasing unease, sensing, without concrete proof, that something beneath her carefully composed exterior did not align with the loyal, grieving companion image she had so successfully cultivated among the pack elders. As Kale's 6th birthday approached in distant Millbrook, unknown to any of the players in this unfolding political drama within Voss territory, the careful balance of secrets and ambitions that had sustained an uneasy peace for years was approaching a breaking point that none of them, not Damien, not Celine, not even Corwin with his years of quiet observation, could fully anticipate. The catalyst, when it finally arrived, would come from the most unexpected direction possible, a chance encounter hundreds of miles from Voss territory that would set in motion a chain of events no one had planned for, and no one could easily control. The market day in Millbrook had drawn an unusually large crowd, merchants from neighboring towns setting up stalls along the main square to sell autumn harvests, woven goods, and small trinkets that always seemed to fascinate the local children. Kale, now 6 years old, and possessed of an insatiable curiosity that constantly tested the boundaries Lyra tried to maintain around his movements, had slipped away from his mother's side while she negotiated prices for winter supplies at a nearby stall. It was only a momentary distraction, the kind of thing that happened easily enough in a crowded market, but Kale's naturally quick reflexes and boundless energy meant that a momentary distraction could translate into considerable distance, covered in very little time. He wandered toward the edge of the market square, drawn by the sight of a merchant's horse, a magnificent animal unlike anything he had encountered in their quiet town, and stood admiring it with wide-eyed fascination, entirely unaware that his brief adventure had placed him directly in the path of danger he could not possibly comprehend. Simon had traveled through countless human settlements over the years, in his role as a scout for the Voss pack, tasked with monitoring territorial boundaries and gathering information about potential threats or opportunities across the wider region. Millbrook lay well beyond any territory the pack actively claimed, but scouts routinely passed through such settlements while traveling between more relevant locations, and Simon had stopped in the town simply to purchase supplies before continuing his journey westward. He noticed the boy almost by accident, his attention initially caught by nothing more than a child's fascination with a merchant's horse, an entirely ordinary sight in any market town. But something about the boy's movements, an unusual grace and confidence uncommon in human children so young, drew Simon's attention more closely. Old instincts honed through years of pack service, recognizing something familiar in the boy's bearing, before his conscious mind had fully processed why. Then the boy turned slightly, reaching up to pet the horse's nose, and his shirt shifted just enough to reveal a small portion of his shoulder. Simon's breath caught in his throat. He knew that mark. Every wolf within Voss territory knew that mark, the crescent moon sigil that had adorned the shoulder of every Voss alpha for generations beyond counting, currently visible, unmistakably, on the exposed shoulder of a child standing in a distant human market town that had no known connection to the pack whatsoever. Simon moved closer, careful to appear casual, drawing near enough to catch the boy's scent beneath the market's competing aromas of livestock, food, and unwashed crowds. Wolf blood, unmistakably, mixed with something else, something that struck Simon as distantly, impossibly familiar, though he could not immediately place why. Then he saw the woman approaching, calling the boy's name with visible relief and mild exasperation, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. Older now, her hair styled differently, dressed in simple human clothing rather than the fine garments befitting an Alpha King's mate, but unmistakably, impossibly, the same woman whose disappearance years earlier had sent shockwaves through the entire pack, whose absence had reshaped the political landscape of their territory in ways still reverberating through pack hierarchy to this very day. Lyra Ashford, alive, here, with a child bearing the unmistakable mark of Voss lineage. Simon forced himself to remain calm, to continue browsing the market stall nearest him as though nothing unusual had occurred, watching from careful peripheral vision as Lyra reached her son, scolding him gently for wandering off before taking his hand firmly and leading him back toward the market center, oblivious to the observer who had just witnessed something that would fundamentally alter the course of events within her old pack. Simon did not approach. He had served the pack long enough to understand the delicate nature of what he had just discovered, understood that whatever had driven Lyra to vanish so completely years earlier, whatever secrets she had been protecting through her prolonged absence, approaching her directly in a crowded market square, risked frightening her into another disappearance before proper protocols could be established for handling such a sensitive discovery. Instead, he watched carefully from a distance for the remainder of the afternoon, noting the small cottage Lyra and her son eventually returned to at the edge of town, memorizing details of the settlement's layout, the patterns of daily life that suggested how long they had likely been established in this location. He gathered every piece of useful information he could, without risking direct contact, then departed Millbrook, as unremarkably as he had arrived, his mind racing throughout the long journey back toward Voss territory, with the enormity of what he had witnessed. He did not report his discovery immediately upon returning. The information was simply too significant, too potentially explosive within the pack's current delicate political balance, to share casually, or without careful consideration of consequences. Simon requested a private audience with Damien directly, bypassing the usual council channels, understanding instinctively that this particular revelation required the utmost discretion until the king himself decided how to proceed. Damien received the request for private audience with mild curiosity, assuming it concerned some minor matter of border security or territorial dispute that Simon had encountered during his scouting duties. Nothing in his expression prepared him for what he actually heard once the study door closed behind them, and Simon began, carefully and deliberately, describing what he had witnessed in the distant human town of Millbrook. Damien's face went through a rapid succession of expressions as Simon spoke, disbelief giving way to dawning hope, hope tempered by fierce, protective anger at the years of separation and uncertainty this discovery implied, all of it underlaid by a profound, overwhelming shock at the revelation of a child bearing the Voss bloodline mark, a child who could only mean one thing given the timeline Simon carefully laid out. "You are certain," Damien said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion, once Simon had finished his account. "Absolutely certain this was Lyra, and that the boy carried our bloodline mark." "Absolutely certain, my king," Simon confirmed. "I served under your father before you. I have known Lyra's face since she was young herself, running through pack grounds alongside her sister. There is no mistaking who I saw, nor the mark I witnessed on the boy's shoulder. It was the crescent moon, unmistakably, precisely as it has appeared on every Voss Alpha before you." Damien sat in stunned silence for several long minutes, processing the implications of what he had just learned. If Simon's assessment of the child's age was accurate, if the timeline aligned with Lyra's disappearance as it clearly seemed to, then he had a son. A son he had never known existed, growing up hundreds of miles away in complete ignorance of his true heritage, his true father, his true place within a lineage stretching back countless generations. The magnitude of what Lyra had kept from him, the years of separation this revelation represented, struck him with a force that left him momentarily unable to speak. Grief and joy and fury, all warring within him simultaneously. "She never told me," he finally managed, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "All these years, and she never sent word, never gave any indication that I had a child somewhere in the world. Perhaps she had her reasons, my king," Simon offered carefully, aware he was treading into delicate territory regarding matters between his king and the woman who had once been his mate. "Whatever those reasons might be, the boy exists, and he carries your bloodline unmistakably. This changes everything regarding the pack's succession concerns, regarding the political pressures currently building around Celine's position." Damien absorbed this observation with growing clarity, his mind already racing ahead to consider the implications. A legitimate heir, undeniably his own blood, existed and could be claimed, could resolve the succession crisis that had plagued the pack for years, could finally silence the growing whispers questioning his fitness to lead, given his failure to secure a clear line of inheritance. But beneath these political calculations lay something far more personal, far more urgent than any consideration of pack stability or succession politics. Somewhere out there, hundreds of miles beyond his territory's borders, his son was growing up without ever knowing his father existed, and the woman he had once loved, whatever her reasons for leaving, had carried this profound secret entirely alone, for 6 long years. "I need to see him," Damien said, standing abruptly, decision crystallizing, with sudden, absolute clarity. "I need to see them both. Prepare for a journey, Simon. You will guide me to Millbrook personally, and we will travel with discretion, revealing nothing to the wider council until I understand fully what I am walking into." Simon nodded, understanding the wisdom in this caution, aware that whatever emotional reunion or confrontation awaited in that distant human town, it needed to happen away from the political machinery already grinding forward within Voss territory, away from Celine's watchful influence, away from anyone who might seek to exploit or complicate what promised to be an already profoundly complicated situation. As preparations began for the journey ahead, neither man could fully anticipate how dramatically this discovery would eventually reshape not just Damien's personal circumstances, but the entire future of the pack itself, nor how quickly the carefully hidden truths surrounding Celine's own long-cultivated schemes would finally begin unraveling once Lyra's presence and her son's undeniable claim to the Voss bloodline entered back into the equation after 6 years of careful, deliberate absence. The journey to Millbrook took Damien and Simon nearly a week of steady travel, moving carefully to avoid drawing unwanted attention, disguised as ordinary human traders rather than the pack representatives they truly were. Damien spent much of the journey in tense silence, his mind cycling through countless imagined scenarios of what awaited him, rehearsing words he suspected would prove entirely inadequate once the actual moment of confrontation arrived. They arrived at the edge of Millbrook on a crisp afternoon, the small town bustling with its usual modest activity, entirely unremarkable to any casual observer, yet holding within its boundaries a truth that had haunted Damien for 6 long years. Simon guided him toward the cottage he had observed during his earlier scouting visit, and Damien found himself standing before a simple, well-maintained home at the edge of town, a garden still showing signs of careful cultivation despite the advancing autumn season, smoke curling gently from the chimney suggesting occupants currently inside. He hesitated at the garden gate longer than he cared to admit, gathering courage he had not needed to summon in years, before finally forcing himself forward and knocking firmly on the wooden door. The door opened, and Lyra stood before him. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra's face cycled rapidly through shock, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to fear, before settling into a carefully guarded neutrality that Damien recognized, with a pang of guilt, as armor she had clearly needed to develop during their years apart. "Damien," she said finally, her voice tight and controlled, "how did you find me?" "May I come in?" he asked, deliberately avoiding her question for the moment, aware that whatever conversation followed deserved privacy rather than being conducted on her doorstep for any passing neighbor to witness. Lyra hesitated, clearly torn between instinctive caution and the practical reality that turning him away would solve nothing, would simply delay a confrontation that now seemed inevitable, given that he had somehow located her after 6 years of careful hiding. Finally, she stepped back, allowing him entry into the small, warm cottage that had been her home for the past several years. The interior was simple but clearly loved, evidence of a life carefully built from modest resources, and Damien's eyes were immediately drawn to small details that spoke of a child's presence. A wooden toy, carved in the shape of a wolf sitting on a shelf, a child's boots by the door, considerably smaller than his own. "Where is he?" Damien asked quietly, unable to keep the question contained any longer. Lyra's composure cracked slightly at this direct acknowledgement of what he clearly already knew. "He is with Mara, a neighbor, for the afternoon." "I did not expect visitors today." She crossed her arms protectively across her chest, a gesture Damien remembered from years earlier, one that always signaled deep emotional distress carefully contained. "How did you find out, Damien?" "I was careful. I was so careful." "A scout recognized you, and recognized him, during a passing visit through the market weeks ago," Damien explained, watching her face carefully for reaction. "He saw the mark on his shoulder, Lyra. There was no mistaking what that meant." Lyra closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this information with visible pain, the careful walls she had constructed around her secret finally, inevitably, beginning to crumble. "I always knew this was possible," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I suppose some part of me even expected it, eventually. I simply hoped for more time." "6 years, Lyra," Damien said, and though he tried to keep accusation from his tone, some of it bled through regardless. 6 years, and you never sent word. Never gave me any indication that I had a son somewhere in the world. Do you have any idea what those years have been like? searching for you, wondering what happened, while you were here, raising our child without me ever knowing he existed. Do not, Lyra said sharply, her own controlled composure, finally breaking under the weight of years of suppressed emotion. Do not stand in my home and speak to me of suffering, Damien, when you are the reason I fled in the first place. I did not choose to hide our son from you out of cruelty. I chose it because I could not trust that revealing his existence would not simply trap me back into a life I had already discovered was built on betrayal. The accusation hung heavy in the small room, years of unspoken grievance finally given voice. Damien absorbed her words with visible pain, understanding, even through his own hurt at years of separation, the legitimate wound underlying her decision. I know I hurt you terribly, he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of accusation. What you witnessed that day, what I allowed to happen, was inexcusable. I have spent 6 years regretting that single moment of weakness, more than I have regretted anything else in my entire life. But Lyra, I need you to know something. What you saw, what you believed, represented ongoing betrayal on my part, was not entirely what it appeared to be. Lyra's expression hardened with skepticism. I saw what I saw, Damien. There is no version of that memory that changes its fundamental truth. I am not disputing what you witnessed, Damien said carefully. I am telling you that circumstance was engineered, deliberately, by someone who understood precisely how to exploit a moment of weakness on my part, for her own long-term benefit. Celine did not stumble into my bed by accident that day, Lyra. She spent months positioning herself for exactly that opportunity. Lyra's face went pale. Old suspicions she had never fully allowed herself to examine, suddenly given weight and confirmation. What are you saying? I am saying that in the years since you disappeared, evidence has slowly accumulated, suggesting Celine's actions were far more calculated than simple momentary weakness on both our parts, Damien explained, the words clearly difficult for him to voice even now. I do not offer this as excuse for my own failures that day, Lyra. I bear full responsibility for allowing circumstances to unfold as they did, regardless of whatever manipulation may have contributed. But I believe you deserve to know the fuller picture of what happened, particularly given everything that has unfolded since. Lyra sank slowly into a nearby chair, absorbing this revelation with visible difficulty. Years of carefully constructed certainty about that terrible day, suddenly complicated by new information she had not anticipated needing to process. Why are you telling me this now? She asked finally. What difference does it make, after everything that has already happened? Because our son deserves to know his true heritage, Damien said simply. Because you deserve to know the fullest possible truth about what happened, regardless of how that truth affects our own complicated history. And because, Lyra, whatever else remains unresolved between us, I would very much like the opportunity to know my son. The sound of the front door opening interrupted their conversation, before Lyra could formulate a response, and both adults turned to see Cale entering the cottage, cheeks flushed from outdoor play, followed closely by Mara, carrying a basket of freshly picked vegetables from her own garden. Cale stopped short upon seeing the unfamiliar man standing in his mother's sitting room, his expression curious rather than alarmed, studying Damien with the open, assessing gaze of a child unafraid of strangers, but naturally cautious around unfamiliar adults. Cale, Lyra said, her voice carefully controlled, despite the emotional storm clearly still churning beneath her composed exterior. Come here, sweetheart. There is someone I need you to meet. Damien knelt down to bring himself closer to the boy's eye level, studying his son's face for the first time, with an intensity that clearly startled Cale slightly, though the boy held his ground admirably, meeting the stranger's gaze with unexpected steadiness. Hello, Cale, Damien said, his voice thick with emotion he struggled to keep contained. My name is Damien. I am your father. The words hung in the small cottage's warm air, and Cale's eyes widened with visible shock, glancing quickly toward his mother for confirmation, uncertain how to process a revelation that upended everything he had understood about his own family for his entire 6 years of life. Lyra met her son's questioning gaze, and nodded slowly, giving silent permission for a truth she had long delayed but could no longer keep hidden. Mara, sensing the profound significance of the moment unfolding before her, quietly retreated toward the kitchen, giving the small family space to navigate this pivotal reunion, without additional witnesses complicating an already overwhelming situation. What followed was hours of careful, halting conversation, Damien learning details of his son's life he had missed entirely, Lyra reluctantly filling gaps in the story of her own 6 years hidden away in Millbrook, Cale slowly warming toward the stranger who claimed to be his father, curiosity gradually overtaking initial wariness as the evening progressed. By the time darkness fell over Millbrook that evening, nothing had been fully resolved between Damien and Lyra, the wounds of betrayal and years of separation, far too complex to heal within a single afternoon's conversation. But something fundamental had shifted regardless. A door that had been firmly closed for 6 years now standing, however tentatively, open once again, and both parents understood, even amid their continued uncertainty and unresolved pain, that their son's existence had irrevocably changed the trajectory of all their futures moving forward. The decision to return to Voss territory did not come easily, and it took several more weeks of careful conversation, difficult negotiation, and slowly rebuilding trust, before Lyra finally agreed to make the journey back to the pack she had fled 6 years earlier. It was not Damien's persuasion alone that finally convinced her, though his patient, consistent presence during those weeks, returning repeatedly to Millbrook despite the demands of his pack duties, did gradually soften some of the defensive walls she had maintained for so long. Ultimately, it was consideration for Cale's future that tipped the balance, a growing recognition that her son deserved the opportunity to understand and claim his full heritage, deserved training and guidance that only pack life could properly provide, as his wolf nature continued developing with each passing year. Mara wept when Lyra finally shared her decision to leave Millbrook, though her tears carried genuine happiness alongside inevitable sadness at losing daily contact with the family she had grown to love as her own over the past 6 years. "You found your way to peace here when you needed it most," Mara told her during their final tearful conversation before departure. "Now it seems your path leads elsewhere, toward a different kind of peace, one your son needs as much as you once needed the quiet safety of this place. I will miss you both terribly, but I understand why you must go." Lyra promised to maintain contact, to visit when circumstances allowed, and Mara made her promise the same, understanding that whatever complicated future awaited Lyra within pack politics, the bond they had built through years of shared hardship and quiet friendship would not simply dissolve with distance. The journey back to Voss territory proved considerably less arduous than Lyra's original flight had been years earlier, traveling now with proper resources and protection, rather than desperate secrecy, though the emotional weight of returning to a place she had fled under such painful circumstances pressed heavily upon her throughout the journey. Cale, for his part, approached the transition with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, alternating between excitement at the prospect of meeting other people like himself for the first time in his young life, and understandable anxiety about leaving behind the only home and community he had ever known. Damien made considerable effort throughout the journey to build genuine connection with his son, sharing stories of pack history, explaining gently the nature of the heritage Cale carried, patient with the countless questions a curious 6-year-old naturally generated about this entirely new world opening before him. Their arrival within Voss territory did not go unnoticed. Word spread rapidly through the pack once trackers spotted the returning party approaching the main gates, and by the time Damien, Lyra, and Cale actually reached the pack house itself, a substantial crowd had gathered, drawn by rumors that had already begun circulating about the king's mysterious return, with the long-vanished former mate and an unknown child at her side. Celine watched their approach from an upper window of the pack house, her expression carefully neutral despite the storm of calculation churning behind her composed exterior. She had received word of Damien's unexplained departure weeks earlier, had grown increasingly suspicious as days turned into weeks without clear explanation, but nothing had prepared her for the sight now unfolding before her. Lyra returned, alive and clearly healthy, accompanied by a child whose very existence threatened to unravel every careful plan Celine had spent years constructing. She descended to greet the returning party with practiced composure, her congratulations to Damien on his son's discovery ringing with barely concealed falseness that experienced observers might have detected, though most within the gathering crowd remained too caught up in the drama of the moment to notice the subtle tension crackling beneath Celine's carefully maintained pleasant demeanor. The Pack Council convened an emergency session that very evening, elders and senior members gathering to address the seismic implications of Cale's arrival and unquestionable claim to Voss lineage. Victor, Examining the boy's birthmark personally, alongside several other senior wolves capable of verifying such matters, confirmed without hesitation that the mark was genuine, unmistakably identical to markings that had appeared on Voss heirs for countless generations. There can be no doubt regarding this child's parentage, Victor announced to the assembled council, his voice carrying clear satisfaction at finally seeing the succession crisis that had plagued the pack for years resolved through such undeniable evidence. The bloodline mark does not appear on children outside the direct Voss lineage. This boy is unmistakably our future heir. Celine, seated among the council members, though her position there had always carried an implicit assumption of eventual formal mate status rather than any official standing, felt the ground shifting beneath her carefully constructed future, with each word Victor spoke. Years of patient positioning, years of careful manipulation, designed to eventually secure her own son Daniel's claim to succession, suddenly threatened by the unexpected return of a legitimate heir she had never anticipated needing to account for in her long-term planning. She excused herself from the council chamber shortly after Victor's announcement, moving quickly through the packhouse corridors toward the private quarters she still maintained, her composed exterior finally cracking once safely away from observing eyes. She needed to think, needed to reconsider strategies that had suddenly become considerably more complicated with Cale's unexpected arrival. Gareth found her there some hours later, having received her urgent summons delivered through discreet channels they had long ago established for their careful, hidden communication. His expression, upon hearing the full scope of what had transpired, mirrored her own growing alarm. "This changes everything," he said grimly, pacing the small room where they had arranged their meeting. "If this boy's claim is confirmed, and it sounds as though the council has already accepted it without meaningful dispute, then Daniel's path to succession becomes considerably more difficult, perhaps impossible through legitimate means." "There must be options remaining," Celine said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested, years of careful confidence beginning to fray under the pressure of circumstances she had never adequately prepared for. "The boy is young, unfamiliar with pack customs, unprepared for the political complexities of pack leadership. Perhaps circumstances could still be arranged that call his suitability into question, or that create sufficient doubt regarding the legitimacy of his mother's claims." Gareth studied her carefully, recognizing the desperate calculation behind her words, even as he shared her underlying anxiety about their son's suddenly compromised future. "Be careful, Celine. Damien is no longer the grieving, distracted man he was in the years following Lyra's disappearance. He has spent years rebuilding his authority within the pack, and now returns with both his former mate and an undeniable heir at his side. Any scheme against them now carries considerably greater risk than it might have years earlier, when the pack's uncertainty made such maneuvering easier to conceal." Celine absorbed this warning with visible frustration, though she recognized the validity of his caution, even as ambition continued churning within her, unwilling to simply accept the collapse of plans she had spent so many years carefully constructing. "I have not survived this long within pack politics through recklessness, Gareth. Whatever course I choose to pursue from here, I will proceed carefully, methodically, exactly as I always have, but I will not simply surrender everything we have worked toward, without exploring every available option first." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and both froze momentarily, before Celine composed herself sufficiently to answer, revealing a young pack messenger with a summons from Victor, requesting her presence in a private meeting regarding matters of pack administration. What Celine did not yet know, as she prepared to attend this seemingly routine summons, was that Corwin, watching the unfolding drama of Cale's arrival, with his own complicated mixture of relief and residual guilt regarding his years of silence about Lyra's escape, had finally decided the time had come to share certain long-held suspicions with Victor regarding patterns of behavior he had observed from Celine over the preceding years, suspicions that, combined with the sudden complications introduced by Cale's return, suggested a deeper investigation into Celine's true motivations and activities, might prove necessary for the pack's continued stability and security. The careful web of secrets, ambitions, and long-hidden truths that had accumulated over 6 years of separation was finally, inevitably, beginning to unravel, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just the immediate question of pack succession, but the fundamental character of leadership and loyalty that would define Voss territory for generations to come. Corwin requested a private audience with Victor the following morning, aware that what he intended to share carried significant weight and required careful, deliberate presentation to be taken with the seriousness it deserved. "I have watched Celine closely these past 6 years," Corwin began, once the two men had settled into Victor's private study, the door firmly closed against any potential eavesdroppers. "At first, I attributed my unease to simple personal bias, given my long-standing friendship with Lyra and my natural sympathy toward her circumstances. But over time, certain patterns emerged that I believe warrant closer examination, particularly given recent events." Victor listened with grave attention as Corwin laid out his observations, carefully organized and presented with the same methodical precision that had made him such an effective head of pack guards over the years. He described Celine's suspiciously convenient positioning during the original incident that had driven Lyra away, the timing that seemed far too precise to be genuinely accidental. He described her steady, patient accumulation of influence within pack administration during subsequent years, always careful never to overreach, always positioning herself as indispensable without appearing overtly ambitious. Most significantly, he described rumors he had heard, secondhand but from sources he considered reliable, regarding Celine's occasional unexplained absences from pack territory over recent years, absences she had always explained away with plausible but never fully verified reasons. "I have no definitive proof of wrongdoing," Corwin admitted honestly. "But taken together, these patterns suggest a level of calculation that concerns me deeply, particularly now that circumstances have shifted so dramatically with young Kale's arrival and confirmed status as legitimate heir. If Celine has indeed been pursuing some longer scheme regarding pack succession, this sudden complication to her plans could prove genuinely dangerous." Victor absorbed this information with the careful consideration of a man who had served the pack through multiple generations of leadership transitions, understanding intimately the kinds of political maneuvering that could threaten stability if left unchecked. "Your concerns align, unfortunately, with certain observations I have made myself over recent years, though I confess I had not connected them with the same clarity you now present. I believe this warrants immediate, careful investigation, conducted with sufficient discretion, to avoid alerting Celine before we have gathered sufficient evidence to act with confidence." The investigation that followed proceeded carefully over the following days. Senior pack members Victor trusted absolutely conducting quiet inquiries into Celine's activities and movements over recent years, careful to avoid drawing attention that might prompt her to destroy evidence, or flee, before the full truth could be established. What they eventually uncovered exceeded even Corwin's initial suspicions in its scope and audacity. Discreet tracking of Celine's movements revealed the location of a small, isolated cabin several days' travel from the main pack territory, a property registered under a false name, but clearly maintained through resources that traced back, through careful financial investigation, to Celine herself. Surveillance of this property over several days confirmed Corwin's worst suspicions, revealing not only Celine's periodic visits, but also the presence of Gareth, whose own connection to the property raised immediate questions, given his established position within the pack's guard structure, and most significantly, evidence of a young boy being raised at this hidden location, a boy whose approximate age aligned precisely with the timeline of Lyra's disappearance years earlier. Victor brought this evidence to Damien personally, understanding the delicate and potentially explosive nature of what had been discovered. Damien's reaction, upon learning the full scope of Celine's apparent long-term deception, cycled through disbelief, fury, and finally a grim, cold determination to see the matter fully resolved. "You are suggesting Celine has maintained a hidden relationship with Gareth for years, has borne him a son she has kept concealed from pack knowledge, all while positioning herself as my devoted companion and eventual mate," Damien said, his voice carrying barely controlled anger, as he processed the full implications of Victor's careful report. "The evidence strongly suggests exactly that scenario, my king," Victor confirmed. Combined with Corwin's observations regarding the suspiciously convenient timing of the original incident that drove Lyra away, and Celine's steady accumulation of influence during the subsequent years of uncertainty regarding pack succession, a clear picture emerges of long-term, calculated manipulation, designed ultimately to position her own son for eventual succession, regardless of legitimate bloodline claims. Damien sat in heavy silence for several minutes, Absorbing the full scope of betrayal this revelation represented, years of manipulation that had cost him not just his relationship with Lyra, but had nearly cost his son the opportunity to ever know his true heritage, had certainly cost them both 6 years of family connection that could never be fully recovered. "We need absolute proof before proceeding formally," Damien said finally, forcing himself back into practical, strategic thinking, despite the personal fury still churning beneath his composed exterior. Celine has proven herself capable of considerable manipulation and deception. Any confrontation must be handled with sufficient evidence to prevent her from twisting circumstances back in her favor, particularly given her established influence among certain council members. The formal confrontation, when it finally came, occurred during a full council session, called specifically to address matters of pack succession, now that Cale's legitimate claim had been thoroughly established and confirmed. Celine arrived at the session with her usual composed confidence, unaware that Victor and Damien had spent the preceding days carefully assembling irrefutable evidence of her long-hidden deceptions. The confrontation, when Victor finally presented the accumulated evidence before the full assembled council, unfolded with dramatic, undeniable clarity. Celine's careful composure crumbled rapidly, as witness after witness, evidence after evidence, painted an unmistakable picture of years of calculated manipulation, from the deliberately engineered incident that had originally driven Lyra away, through years of patient positioning within pack administration, culminating in the discovery of her hidden relationship with Gareth and their concealed son, all part of a long-term scheme to eventually claim succession for a child with no legitimate blood claim whatsoever to the position she had spent years working to secure for him. "You have betrayed this pack's trust in ways that go far beyond simple personal ambition," Damien said, his voice carrying cold, controlled fury, as he addressed Celine directly before the assembled council, Lyra standing silently at his side, her own expression a complex mixture of vindication and lingering pain, as years of unconfirmed suspicion finally received undeniable proof. "You engineered circumstances that drove my mate into hiding for 6 years, deprived my son of any knowledge of his true heritage for the majority of his young life, all while positioning yourself to eventually install your own illegitimate heir through years of careful, calculated deception." Celine, recognizing the overwhelming weight of evidence arrayed against her, finally abandoned her carefully maintained composure entirely, alternating between defiant justification and desperate pleading as the full council listened with growing revulsion at the scope of betrayal she had perpetrated over so many years. "Everything I did because I believed I deserved better than the position circumstance had assigned me," Celine said, her voice carrying genuine bitterness beneath its increasingly desperate edge. "I watched Lyra inherit privileges and status I believed should rightfully have been mine, watched her sister receive honors I felt I had earned through years of loyal service to this pack. I simply took what I believed I was owed." "You took nothing that was owed to you," Victor said sharply, his own anger evident despite his usual measured composure. "You engineered a betrayal that cost this pack years of instability, that cost a mother and child years of separation from their rightful place within our territory, all to satisfy ambitions that had no legitimate foundation whatsoever." The council's judgment, once all evidence had been fully presented and Celine's own admissions had removed any remaining doubt regarding her culpability, proved swift and severe. Celine and Gareth were formally exiled from Voss territory, stripped of any remaining influence or standing within pack hierarchy. Their son Daniel, innocent of his parents' schemes despite the circumstances of his birth, left in a genuinely difficult position that the council eventually resolved by arranging his placement with a distant, trustworthy pack family, willing to raise him away from the poisonous influence of his biological parents' ambitions. As the council session finally concluded, the assembled pack members, dispersing with the weight of dramatic revelations still settling over the gathered crowd, Lyra found herself standing beside Damien in the aftermath of a confrontation that had, at last, revealed the full truth behind the betrayal that had originally shattered their bond and driven her into 6 years of hidden exile. The vindication, when it finally arrived, brought less immediate comfort than she might have expected years earlier, tempered instead by the weight of everything lost during those 6 painful years of separation, years that could never be fully recovered, regardless of how thoroughly Celine's schemes had ultimately been exposed and punished. But standing there, watching Kale across the emptying council chamber, chatting with unexpected ease with several young pack children, curious about their newly discovered future alpha. Lyra felt something within her chest, something that had remained tightly guarded and wounded for 6 long years, finally begin, cautiously, to soften. The weeks following Celine's exile brought a strange, unfamiliar quiet to Voss territory, the pack slowly adjusting to a future finally settled, after years of uncertainty regarding succession and stability. Kale, meanwhile, faced the considerable challenge of adapting to an entirely new world, learning pack customs and traditions that had been entirely foreign to him throughout his 6 years growing up in Millbrook. Damien took personal charge of much of his son's education during this transitional period, patient and attentive, in ways that surprised many pack elders who remembered the distracted, grief-stricken alpha of years past. He taught Kale the history of their bloodline, the responsibilities that would eventually accompany his position as future alpha, the practical skills of controlled shifting that Kale had never had proper opportunity to develop while living in careful secrecy among humans. Lyra watched this developing relationship between father and son with cautious, gradually warming approval, her own complicated feelings toward Damien remaining unresolved, even as she recognized, with each passing week, the genuine sincerity of his efforts to build meaningful connection with the child he had missed, knowing for so many years. Their own relationship, hers and Damien's, proceeded far more carefully, neither rushing toward the easy intimacy that had once characterized their original bond, before betrayal had shattered it so thoroughly. Damien understood, with hard-won wisdom accumulated over 6 painful years of separation, that trust once broken could not simply be reassembled through mere explanation, or even through the vindication that Celine's exposed schemes had provided. Rebuilding required patience, consistent demonstration of changed priorities, genuine willingness to prove himself worthy of trust rather than simply expecting its automatic restoration. "I do not expect things between us to simply return to how they once were," Damien told her during a quiet evening walk through the pack gardens some weeks after their return, the same gardens where Lyra had once left her pendant on a stone bench before disappearing into the northern wilderness. "I understand the years we lost cannot simply be erased, nor can the pain you experienced discovering my betrayal, regardless of the manipulation that contributed to it. I am not asking for immediate forgiveness, Lyra. I am simply asking for the opportunity to demonstrate, over time, that I am worthy of rebuilding what we once shared, at whatever pace feels right to you." Lyra considered his words carefully, walking in thoughtful silence for several minutes, before finally responding. "I appreciate your patience, Damien, truly. These past weeks, watching you with Kale, watching the genuine effort you have made to understand and connect with him, despite everything that separated you both for so long, has shown me a side of you I perhaps did not fully appreciate before everything fell apart between us. I am not ready to simply set aside 6 years of pain and betrayal, however thoroughly its origins have now been explained, but I am willing to remain here, to allow our relationship the space to develop naturally, without predetermined expectations about where it might eventually lead." This careful, measured approach characterized the months that followed, Damien and Lyra gradually rebuilding trust through consistent, patient interaction, rather than any dramatic reconciliation, their evolving relationship providing stable, supportive co-parenting for Kale, even as the deeper romantic question of their future remained unresolved and unrushed. Mara visited Voss territory twice during this period, delighted to witness Kale's adjustment to his new life, while maintaining the important connection to his early childhood that Lyra had promised to preserve. These visits brought genuine joy to the pack house. Mara's warm, practical presence, a welcome reminder of the resilience and resourcefulness Lyra had demonstrated throughout her years of careful hiding, qualities the entire pack had come to respect deeply once the full story of her survival and Kale's protection during those difficult years became more widely understood. Corwin, whose long silence regarding Lyra's original escape had weighed heavily on his conscience throughout the intervening years, finally found opportunity to properly apologize to both Lyra and Damien for the role his assistants had played in the painful separation that followed. Though both, understanding the genuine care that had motivated his original decision, quickly reassured him that his loyalty to Lyra during her moment of desperate need had ultimately proven a kindness rather than a betrayal, allowing her the space and safety necessary to protect their son during those crucial early years. Victor, meanwhile, took particular satisfaction in personally overseeing Kale's early education regarding pack governance and leadership responsibilities, recognizing in the boy a natural intelligence and empathy that suggested considerable promise for his eventual role as alpha. He carries his mother's compassion alongside his father's strength, Victor observed to Damien during one training session, watching Kale interact with unusual patience and kindness toward a younger pack member struggling with a difficult lesson. This pack will be fortunate indeed when the time eventually comes for him to claim full leadership. As the first full year following their return to Voss territory drew toward its close, the pack gathered for the traditional autumn celebration that marked the changing seasons, a festival Lyra remembered fondly from her childhood, one she had never expected to experience again after fleeing years earlier into uncertain human territory. The gathering brought together the entire pack, wolves of all ages and ranks, celebrating together around great bonfires as autumn's first true chill settled over the territory, music and laughter filling the evening air, in a display of communal joy that stood in stark contrast to the political turmoil and uncertainty that had characterized the pack for so many preceding years. Damien stood near the central bonfire as the celebration reached its peak, watching Kale dance around the fire with several other pack children, his son's easy laughter carrying clearly across the gathering, a sound Damien had feared. During those darkest years of searching and uncertainty, he might never have opportunity to hear. Lyra approached to stand beside him, following his gaze toward their son's joyful celebration, and for a long, comfortable moment, neither of them spoke, simply sharing quiet appreciation for the hard-won peace this moment represented. "He belongs here," Lyra said finally, her voice carrying genuine warmth rather than the guarded caution that had characterized so much of her communication with Damien over recent months. "I can see that clearly now, watching him tonight. Whatever difficulty brought us to this point, whatever pain we both endured along the way, I believe we made the right choice, returning here, allowing him this heritage and this community." "And you?" Damien asked carefully, watching her expression rather than the bonfire celebration before them. "Do you believe you belong here as well, Lyra? Not simply as Kale's mother, but as yourself, as the woman who once called this place home before everything went so terribly wrong between us?" Lyra considered this question seriously, taking her time before finally responding with quiet, thoughtful honesty. "I believe I am beginning to believe that, yes. It has taken time, and I suspect it will continue taking time before I fully trust this peace as something permanent rather than fragile. But standing here tonight, watching our son celebrate among people who clearly already love him, feeling the warmth of this community I once fled in desperate fear, I find myself hopeful in ways I had not expected to feel again." Damien reached out slowly, giving her ample opportunity to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hand in his own. Lyra did not pull away, though her grip remained careful, tentative, appropriate to the still developing trust between them, rather than any dramatic declaration of restored devotion. They stood together in comfortable, hopeful silence, watching their son dance joyfully around the great bonfire, surrounded by a pack finally settled after years of turbulent uncertainty, the crescent moon mark on Kale's shoulder, catching the firelight as he moved, visible proof of the heritage he had finally claimed after 6 years of hidden absence. The path ahead remained far from simple. Trust, once so thoroughly broken, would require continued patient rebuilding rather than instant restoration. Kale faced years of training and preparation before he would be ready to eventually assume the full responsibilities awaiting him as future alpha. The wider pack itself continued adjusting to the dramatic upheavals of recent months, integrating lessons learned from Celine's exposed betrayal into stronger, more careful governance moving forward. But standing together beneath the star-filled autumn sky, watching their son celebrate his rightful place among a community finally at peace, Damien and Lyra understood that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them now, with the most important truth of their long, difficult journey finally secured. Their son was home. Their family, however imperfectly reassembled after years of painful separation, was finally, genuinely, beginning to heal. The bonfire burned bright against the darkening sky, and somewhere beyond the celebrating crowd, an old stone bench sat quiet in the moonlit garden, The same bench where a silver pendant had once been left behind in desperate flight, now simply another peaceful corner of a home that had, against considerable odds, finally welcomed its lost family back into the fold where they had always truly belonged.